So welcome to our 9th session of this Parables Bible study. It is flying by. I do have some news that I hope you'll receive as good news, and that is we're going to extend the Parables Bible study class by 3 sessions. And part of the reason for doing that is that normally we take a summer break after about June, just for like July and maybe part of August. And so I'm going to do that this summer as well. And there were some more stories that I could find. So rather than trying to find a smaller Bible study to fill that gap, I found there's some more material that we could do. So I've included 3 new parables, and they will be in the notes that are posted with the Bible study each week. Okay, so you can find them on the church website, but there's three more sessions to be included. So we have next week and then 3 more, so 4 total after today. So today's class, today's parable is another classically challenging parable. And you know there's some interesting notes about this as we get into it. And that is that of all Jesus' parables, there's really just this one that sort of centers around this idea of a king, of a worldly king. Whereas in rabbinic parables and in sort of the Israel tradition, about half would sort of be centered around a king. So there's this dynamic going on, and Jesus sort of setting a dividing line here. And there are some scholars that sort of that consider, why is it this way? And it might be that because of the way kings are in the world and in the empire, they are seen as sort of power hungry. They're not typically the best examples for illustrating the way God's kingdom works in comparison. So Jesus may be reluctant to use them, or Jesus might be making a point in comparison to the way Israel values their kings. At the end of the day, Jesus, the way kings operate in the imperial world doesn't tend to align with the way Jesus tends to describe the kingdom of God. So hold that in mind. Second thing, this parable appears in a section of Matthew that involves 5 sermons or conversations around this idea, the broader idea of church order and how the church should function. And so this what we're about to read today is the 4th in that series of 5. And it's sort of formulaic. Matthew kind of has these introductory lines that he does, and then closing lines with each time, one of these little discourses happens. And I wrote it down. He says, generally the formula at the end of each of these sermons or conversations is, and so when Jesus had finished this instruction, he took leave of Galilee. And it just sort of indicates that Matthew is sort of taking these resources from other places and putting them into his narrative. No big deal. That's what gospel writers do. They're crafting a narrative. These didn't just appear in this form. That's important for us to remember. One of the things that Matthew also does is, in order to link the parable we're about to see to Peter's question that he asks. Now, I only assigned the verses of the parable. We will read the whole sort of the whole kit and caboodle today, just a couple verses before and 1 verse after. Not a big deal, but it gives us a little bit more context. But in order to connect what Peter's question is to the parable we're going to study, Matthew crafts this very specific line. And he says, this is why heaven's imperial rule should be compared to ... Okay, that's, what is that, verse 23. Now, one of the things for a tip, for keeping in mind, an interpretive tip, is that when you say that in that way, when you say it can be compared to, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a comparison of similarity. It could be a comparison of difference. So just keep your eye open for that. And then also, Matthew has constructed the last line, which we'll read today, verse 35, as his sort of interpretation of this parable. And that's significant because it's a very specific interpretation of what the parable means. But most scholars believe that the parable itself occurs between, or ends at verse 34, okay, that the original parable. Now I got to say this, that the way Matthew has used this parable, the way he sets it, the way he interprets it, has been confounding to scholars, interpreters, students of the Bible for generations. And part of it is because of the language he uses and the way what he does here. So after Jesus demands this abundance of forgiveness from Peter, he then launches into this parable that describes a king who forgives a large debt. And then when the slave kind of makes a mistake, the king punishes that slave immediately on that first offense. And it leaves us with some troubling questions, especially since in Matthew's interpretation in verse 35, he clearly equates the king in the parable with God. Jesus says, "So will my Father do this to you." So it leaves us with these questions like, okay, if that's what this really means, then is God's forgiveness conditional? Can it be taken away? Is God reliable? Is this ending punishment that we see, is it imposed or is it allowed? And I have to say that in general, Matthew tends to write and express his stories like this. And when you consider, and by like this, he's always writing with this sense of raising the bar. Okay, that's his attitude. And part of it has to do with when Matthew was written, it was after the Gospel of Mark and the apocalyptic vision that the Gospel of Mark expected, that Christ would return and basically the day would be saved. Well, that didn't happen. And so the next gospel writers like Matthew and Luke had to deal with, all right, well, what does it mean to talk about the kingdom of God when the apocalypse or when the second coming didn't happen? And how do we do this? And so he's writing in a way of saying, all right, the kingdom of God is born in our midst. How do we enact it? How do we participate in it? Matthew was writing in a context where he was saying, if you want to be a real Jew, and by real Jew to Matthew, he meant the Jews that follow Jesus, you got to raise the bar. So it's not just about following Torah. It's about living Torah. It's about enacting an ethic that is higher than what has been before. So you've got all these beautiful stories in Matthew. Maybe one of the famous ones is Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. That one where we often quote, just as you have done to the least of these in my family, you have done to me. Beautiful statement. But don't forget the corollary to that parable. And in part of that parable is also, just as you have not done to the least of these, you have not done to me, and the punishment will be a weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's like, it's a big, whoa, it's intense. But I need to tell you that that's part of Matthew's worldview. That's Matthew's interpretation. That's Matthew's use of that parable. And our job as students of the Bible is to discern for ourselves, wherein might Matthew have it right? What is he trying to communicate? Or are there other avenues of truth within a particular parable because they come from sources, they come from traditions that were in circulation well before the parables in which we now see them? So that's part of our consideration. And so for today, when you see that this parable traditionally is viewed as, well, the whole idea is we need to be forgiving just like God is forgiving. And if we're not forgiving, then watch out. That if we go a little deeper than that, and again, I think we've seen that in the parables, the sort of easy black and white interpretations, it's not that they're wrong, it's just that they're not really what it might be getting at. So today our job is to sort of say, all right, let's get past sort of the moralisms, the black and white, and get into a little bit more of that gray water. And then see maybe what is this parable saying about God, about the world, and about the structures and systems in which we all live, and how that impacts our ability to work towards, to move towards the ways of God. So that's my introduction. And I'd like to offer it now for anyone that has any questions or comments. Raise your hand and then I'll call on you. Is that a raised hand, Julie, or is that just you? And you need to unmute yourself still.
I was just scrolling.
There you go.
I'm on my.
Oh, I see. You're on your phone. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other any comments about, you know, as you read this parable, any initial concerns? Has my introductory comments touched on some of the places that you had questions or wonderings about, or had you had a whole different kind of approach to this parable? Boyce.
You know, when I read that, it reminded me of the Lord's Prayer. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors.
Yep. But notice what's not included in the Lord's Prayer is, and if you don't forgive your debtors, you're going to be punished, you're tormented by torturers, kind of thing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Jim.
Yeah, I thought, I guess from years of learning or whatever, that God's forgiveness was unconditional. So why all of a sudden is it conditioned? It just seems that way to me.
I agree with you in terms of, if you take the vantage point or the interpretive perspective that Matthew offers, you are in alignment with many others who have read this parable. Jim asked that same question. So it will, we'll get to look at that and hopefully, you know, come up with some other options, because that's the key. It's, again, not about saying, oh, that's wrong, so throw it out. But it's about saying, all right, that's not the only way of looking at this. Let's consider what else it might be. But you're right. Matthew does seem to be saying that there is this element of punishment that will result in not sort of practicing forgiveness in the ways that that this parable is suggesting. I saw Bonnie.
Well, as someone who used to listen to Joel Osteen on Sunday mornings before I started coming to this church, you know, I was sort of drawn to verse 29, where it talks about if you leave your house and your wife in it, and, you know, brothers and parents and so forth. It says you'll receive many times as much in the present as in the coming life through the ages. And so when I first read that, I thought, oh, this is one of those Osteen claim your promise verses, like, you know, God wants you to have more and more. But then as I reread it, I thought, well, but that comes after leaving everything else that you have. And by saying that you will have more, I don't think necessarily means material goods. It may be a richer life in other ways.
I think that does tend to be true. I'm not sure the verses you cited are pertinent to the parable. That just, did you say it was verse 18 that was, Bonnie, that sort of leads into this? Because there's a number of discourses that lead, but today we're going to be covering verses 21 to 35 in Matthew 18. But still, you're bringing up a point where it's...
Oh, you know what? Never mind. I read Luke 18, 24 to 34. Not Matthew. I'm sorry.
Hey, we're all in this together. I sent out the wrong verses, so it's okay. You never know what's going to come up. Anyone else? All right, well, oh, go ahead. Yeah, Donna. Need to unmute yourself still.
Sorry.
That's okay.
As far as Matthew's interpretation at the end about, you know, God will throw you in the fire of hell or whatever if you don't forgive others, I took that more from a psychological perspective. That I know if you don't forgive somebody for whatever it is, you feel like they've mistreated you, abused you, slighted you in some way. If you continue to carry that with you, it eats you up.
Yep.
You're the one who's being punished, not the person who wronged you. So that's how I took that.
it's a powerful insight. And I think you brought something up that's also important to notice. And that is, in these parables, we need to always attend very carefully to what the language is saying. And at the end, the king doesn't necessarily throw the slave, actively causing the slave to be tormented. Look at the way that it's said, and it might be a little nuanced from that. And it might point to some of what Donna was saying. I'll say that. It leaves it open. This is probably a good time for us to actually read the text, at least in the New Revised Standard, and then kind of see how it all plays out, including the beginning portion that we didn't read for today yet, or well, maybe you did, and then Matthew's interpretive tag at the end. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to, go ahead, Marilyn, before we get into that. Unmute.
There we go.
There it is.
Okay. And this says something very positive about what we do on Tuesday morning. Because when I read something where I think, that doesn't fit other things I've thought or whatever, then the thing that pops in my head is, I wonder what we'll decide on Tuesday.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important that it doesn't, again, these aren't supposed to be the simplest things. These are naturally very challenging riddle-like stories. So we've already seen that even Luke, when he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, he sort of puts it in this context of who is my neighbor. And as we saw, it's like, well, that doesn't really necessarily answer that question. I believe that that the gospel writers themselves were trying to figure this out as they went, and they crafted a narrative to sort of make an argument. It doesn't mean that the parables all naturally fit in the way that they incorporated them. So I think it's a really important tact for us to maintain as interpreters, to say, all right, let's do the best we can to allow a story, insofar as we can isolate what a story is, to speak for itself, alongside the way that the gospel writer might want us to understand it. That's all. So this is all very good. And I hope that's how we do continue to feel as equipped to kind of engage that process. That's really what it comes down to. Now, I know that's not how a lot of us were raised, but I do think that ultimately that sense of openness, that open approach, is one that is incredibly liberating in our faith. So let's, unless I see any other hands waving. Oh, I do. There's Boyce.
When I read this, I thought the king's, I guess if you want to call it a punishment, was really I'm not coming up with a word, but it's not, it meets what the guy did. He didn't forgive somebody's debt. And so the king said, okay, I'm not going to forgive your debt. Pay it back. Which he could have taken him out and given him 100 lashes. He could have done things that didn't really, really punished him physically or mentally. But in essence, he took away what he had given him, and it was a natural consequence.
Okay. Well, let's look at the text and see if that's actually what, I think that's part of what we'll do as we go through this. We'll really see, does the punishment match the crime? We'll see how that plays out, because there is some specific language in there. Let's take a look at it. Okay. I'll read it to you. I'll share the screen. I have it pulled up here. Where is it? Why is it not showing? Well, I don't know why it's not calling it up. So I'm just going to, I'll read it to you. Can you still all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I don't know if you can see this, but my share screen is not working the same as it normally does. All right. So this is Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, If another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. And as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I'll pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother and sister or sister from your heart. Okay. I hope you heard that all right. So, all right, let's get into this. We'll try to do our best to leave room for all sorts of questions because there's a lot of different rabbit holes we can go down in this. There always are. But I want to say, I'll start with this. From the outset, from that initial like Peter Jesus thing, what are the cues that this entire narrative, this entire parable is enmeshed in hyperbole? What are from the outset, we're given a cue that that this is all loaded with hyperbole. Jay.
I think it would come down to the amounts of forgiveness or the number, and also throughout the story, and I was reading in some of my notes, it could almost be taken as humorous, or the entire story is being taken as humorous because of the exaggerated amounts being given here and the exaggerated penalties.
Exactly. So let's start with the number of times that Jesus says to forgive someone. Some of your translations will say 77. Some of it will be 70 times, 7 times, so 490. And if you're a literalist, this will drive you crazy because you're like, all right, well, which one is it, Jesus? How do I forget? And the point is, it doesn't matter which one you go with. Exactly as Jay said, these numbers are meant to say, it's not about the math, okay? It's about a posture. It's about a way of being in the world. And so these numbers are meant to say, forget that, okay? You're asking the wrong question, Peter. And so then he tells this parable. He goes into this parable. And then also, as Jay brought up, the parable itself incorporates so much hyperbole because, and this is where we miss it. We hear something like a talent and we're like, okay, that's significant, I guess. I don't. Do you know that one talent is worth 15 years of wages in that time? So basically, he owes him 10,000 talents. So that's 15 times 10,000. That's 150,000 years worth of wages. Exactly as Jay said, this is meant to be absurd. It's almost like a kid saying, well, he owed me a bazillion jillion dollars. You know, it's just supposed to be this absurd number. Okay, and that's the point, because he's trying to break us out of our heads of the whole math thing. And it makes sense because when Peter asked the question, he thinks he's being generous. The accepted practice of that day within rabbinic Judaism was that forgiving someone 3 times was required. The 4th time, not so much. So Peter's like, well, I'll double that and add 1, you know, whatever. Is 7 times enough? And again, 7 is the perfect number. So there's this symbolism here. And Jesus just blows that out of the water, okay? This whole 10,000 talents thing is an absurd number. It also happens to be, if you read Josephus, it's the exact amount that is the tribute that Pompey requires of the Jews when he conquers Judea. And 10,000 is the largest single unit of number that is sort of written, singularly written in Greek. So you could write bigger numbers than that, but it's all these combinations. But 10,000 is the letter mu, and it's pronounced 10,000 is myriad, but it's where our word myriad comes from, a myriad. So anyway, that's sort of where that hyperbole continues, as Jay indicated. Any other comments about the hyperbole, the numbers, anything like that? Any questions about that? All right, how is the king portrayed in this parable? Recognizing that, you know, at the beginning it might be different than at the end, but how is the king, what are the ways that the king is portrayed? Jay?
Almost benevolent but fair.
Well, I like that. I like that because benevolent almost to an extreme, right? I mean, it's if he forgives this amount that one couldn't pay off in 150,000 years, that is just absurd forgiveness levels. And then I will say this, at the end, he's presented differently. Okay, he's presented differently. Now, we might interpret it to be fair. We might interpret it, as Boyce said, as to be the punishment that fits the crime, sort of the natural outcome. We also might interpret it, depending on our worldview, as unjust, as harsh, as ruthless. The parable doesn't say, does it? It just sort of lays it out there, that this king who was so benevolent, so forgiving, has by the end of the parable moved to this place of being quite the opposite, quite harsh, quite full of judgment, okay? It at least leaves us with questions. But again, when you look at what the parable says, it doesn't come to a judgment about the king, about the motivations. Matthew adds that, but the parable itself just kind of lays it out there, okay? How is the unforgiving slave apprehended? Donna.
Well, people tell on him. They turn him in.
That's a key. That's a key. Yeah. Horty, did you want to add to that? Unmute.
By his fellow slaves, his contemporaries.
Yes. Yeah, it's as you're both saying, his fellow slaves turn him in. They are distressed by this. They recognize that it's wrong, and so they go to the king, and because of that, the king turns back. He reneges on his offer of forgiveness, and then basically he sends the servant away to be punished. Now, Boyce, that you know, or anyone else who is thinking this way, now that you know that if 10,000 talents represents 150,000 years worth of salary, of pay, we know that there's no way that slave is ever going to repay that. So he has been sentenced to torture for the rest of his life. So does that match the crime? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe not. But there might be a different point to saying it like this, right? There might be a different comparison here. That what are the standards by which we're assessing who gets forgiveness and who doesn't? You know, that's a big thing that this is asking us, that this parable is asking us. In fact, if you set aside, you know, Matthew's verse 35, where he sort of says, this king is like God. You set aside that and look at the parable, and it's just talking about a king. And you think about kings in the world, especially at that time, and you know, you're talking about a system that was very much hierarchical, the pyramid that you may have ever seen. We've talked about in Bible study and other classes before, but very few at the top benefited from the system as it was. And then everyone else was sort of part of this system where you basically were, you know, some people had it okay, and most people had to struggle to survive and to hold on to what power they had. It was a patron-client type of system. It was an honor-shame type of system, a benefactor system where you had to get in good with everybody. Hey, it's not altogether different than the way our system works today, but it really was not. It was set up so very, very few people at the top would succeed. So what type of commentary might this parable be making on the capacity of a system, of a structure like that, for ever doing God's way, or performing, you know, operating as God operates? Can you see that? What kind of commentary might it be offering us? Is it possible within a system, the worldly system, to practice God-like or God's type of forgiveness? Yeah, go with your gut there. I think what it showed us is that ultimately, no. The structure might allow for, say, one to do it, but then when it gets broken, it falls apart quickly. And what it might be trying to say, and what I think it's partly trying to say, is that in our structures, in our systems, and back in that day, that system of client, patron, honor, shame, all that stuff was incapable of ultimately performing God's way of forgiveness, God's way of justice. And what's interesting about this is this parable is a real commentary about sort of a couple things. One is the Jewish expectation of the Messiah coming as a worldly king. It's a commentary about that. And basically they expected a king to arise who would save the day in the current system of things. Jesus has long been, but is also in this, you know, throughout the gospel, this has been turned on its head. But this parable is also turning that on its head and saying, be careful what you wish for, because here's the deal. You've got, you know, in this way of being, you've got a king that can forgive, you know, a certain amount of huge debt. That's great. But then look at the end. All of a sudden, that king, there's a capricious nature to the systems that we all live in. It can change like that. And all of a sudden, what you think is this gracious act can turn on you in a second, and it will. And everyone who's being spoken to in that day knows how that works. They know that there's no guarantees, that you basically survive, and you hope that you're treated well. But things can change on a dime. So I think this parable is speaking to that expectation of putting all our hopes in the worldly king, especially where the Messiah is concerned. And here's another cool thing it does. As you read a parable, you relate to different characters, right? When you saw the group of slaves react to the unforgiving slave, how did you react to that? When they turned him in, how did you respond? Horty?
I saw them as tattlers.
Okay. You saw them as tattlers. Anyone else? Bonnie?
I thought he deserved it.
Those are a couple different, very powerful, but very appropriate reactions, right? One is one way, one's the other. For those of us who see that as being, hey, he got his desserts, and that sort of pushes that button of justice, that's the way it's supposed to work. The parable is sort of saying, look, if you're cheering on those other slaves that turn in the unforgiving slave, then you are acting exactly in the same way as that unforgiving slave. This, much like last week when we had the parable of the shrewd manager, and it sort of presented this world that was so gray, and we're all implicated in it. We're all sort of made dirty by it because we exist in it. I think this parable is doing much the same. It's trying to say, look, none of us is operating outside this system. Okay? We're all stuck in it. And it can fall apart so quickly. There's no consistent way that forgiveness in the way God's talking about will work in a system like this, because we're all competing against each other. We're all struggling to make ends meet because there's no guarantees. And so we are all fighting to hold on to desperately the power and the prestige and the position that we all have. And in that system, you could have a king, maybe a Messiah that comes in to forgive all the debts, but it can fall apart in an instant underneath that. And then all of a sudden it's chaos. And it brings up that whole point that I think a lot of us maybe have heard. And that is, if Jesus came preaching today, the same message, do you think we'd crucify him again? You better believe we would. We already have. You know, this is what we do to the prophets. Because when they speak truth and they upset the system, the structures in which we operate, it's too much to deal with. I think this parable is saying, look, within the current structures, within the current system, they will always break down. We will always find ourselves being accountants and sort of paying attention to the stuff that doesn't matter to God. It will always break down somewhere. So Jesus, in saying this, is saying, look, a different system is needed. One that's outside of sort of the client-patron style, the honor-shame way of being, the royal power type thing. One that's different. That's the only way that sort of, you know, God's ways can be enacted. What do you think of that, Jim?
You know, something that popped into my head as you were talking was, you know, should a misgiving or a, you know, let's say in this case a crime, not really a crime, but go unpunished? You know, which side do you look at? I mean, it seems like in the God view, at least way, should be forgiven. But on the other hand, you know, in my worldview anyway, you've done wrong, and there should be an atoning for that. And
well, go ahead.
And so I guess I'm at a conflict here as to, you know, or maybe I'm misreading it, but I'm kind of at a conflict as to should it or shouldn't it be punished. You know, now, you know, obviously there's various levels of, you know, of activity, but, you know,
I think this is exactly what the parable is trying to address, Jim. And I think when Peter approaches Jesus with his question about numbers and about accounting and about a calculator and about who deserves forgiveness and when, he's approaching it from the worldview that most of us come at it with. And that is this idea that there has to be atonement. There's got to be justice. And we often put ourselves in the position of being the one to administer the justice. And this parable and Jesus' response is trying to tell us that we're asking the wrong question. We're focusing on the wrong thing. And maybe one of the things it's saying is, if you have to ask how many times you should forgive someone, then you don't know what forgiveness is. If you have to rely on systems that create sort of okay, we have to have this, and this tit for tat, and that's what happens if you do this. If that's your highest aspiration, and that's, again, sort of that legalistic way of living that a lot of times the Pharisees and the scribes are accused of. Okay, rightly or wrongly, that's what they're accused of. If that's our way of being in the world, it is not consistent with what Jesus is talking about, what God's way of being is. And again, I'm not saying this is obviously very challenging. And there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about, well, you gotta, he's not just saying, forgive somebody in an abusive relationship. Forgiveness has to do with, also valuing yourself in different things. And you can forgive someone while ending a relationship or something like that. There's a lot of examples we could come up with. But in terms of a way of living in the world and a way of approaching things, I think this parable puts in stark contrast the way that the world sets it up and the way that God is trying to set it up. Any other comments about that? Horty, and then Margaret.
It just brings to mind the point that I'm at least hearing you make, and that is that you really cannot answer the question with any degree of mathematics. And it continues to raise the question that I think Jim raises so well, which is being conflicted about what do I forgive? What do I forget? And it is beyond what we usually do, what by the focus of humanity, whether we forgive all the time or never forgive or vary between the two viewpoints, but that it's beyond the system that can be developed by humanity, which is why the kingdom of God is not where we live or not how we can live, but that we retain the questions in an ongoing fashion of our living. The question will always remain for us living in the worldly system.
Yeah, beautifully said. And while the parable doesn't necessarily give us the pathway out, it's telling us what the system is not, or what God's way of being is not. And that's often where the challenge is. A lot of us approach religion and we want it to tell us what to do, how we should, just the rules we should follow. But you see, even that approach goes right back into that Peter way of being, according to this parable. Give me the numbers, give me the way to do it, give me the list, and I'll follow that, and then I'll be it. And then if we're doing that, we're very mechanical, we're very like automatons, and then that's not forgiveness. That's just creating lists so that, I don't know, down the road we can get our reward. That is not what Jesus is talking about here. It's a much messier world than that. Again, much like last week's shrewd manager, where everyone was just in the mess. And so don't wait to be pristine and clean and perfect before you start exploring and really getting into some of the nitty gritty. Margaret, I saw your hand up. Let me unmute you, or here.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Okay. Many months ago, when I was in renewal faith with you, you convinced me that when I was angry and with my problem, and you were showing me that it wasn't hurting the other person, it was hurting me. Well, I was surprised when I listened to you that when I quit being angry at this person, I found peace.
Yeah.
And I felt better.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think, what you just brought up kind of connects to what Donna shared with us earlier. And that is that maybe one of the takeaways and maybe one of the ways of incorporating that last line there that's so challenging is not that God or that the king in this parable, even if you want to call it God, it's not that God sort of sends us actively away to be punished, to be tormented. But if we operate within this numbers, this calculus, these conditions of forgiveness in our world, if we choose to operate like that, if we resist being forgiving in a way that's guided by grace and not lists and numbers, then we may find ourselves tormented our whole lives, just as you've been saying, because we can't. There's certain debts that just will never be repaid. Maybe they're debts to ourselves or within ourselves. They might be debts to other people or from other people to us. Regardless, if you don't practice forgiveness the way God does, or the way that's motivated by the grace part, there's an element in a sort of a metaphorical but also literal way, like physical way. It will manifest and it will torment us, maybe our whole lives. I think that's partly what this is saying too. And again, the language isn't that the king did the punishing. The king it's more of an allowance. The king handed him over or whatever, allowed that punishment to happen. This is a parable, once again, that's enmeshed in hyperbole. It's all hyperbole. It's all accentuated to make a bigger point. And so that's where I think it's helpful to sort of say, all right, let's look at this from a whole bunch of different avenues, because it adds such a bigger picture, a bigger sense of meaning than, okay, well, I better be forgiving or else. It's not just that. It's recognizing that, well, for me, it's partly recognizing that we're all part of a system that has inherent implicit limitations. We are all enmeshed in it. And until we see that I'm not pure, you're not pure, none of us is in the clear, until we can see how dirty our hands are, that only then can the gritty kind of real work of forgiveness and reconciliation begin. I think that's partly what this might be pointing us toward. Any other kind of, thoughts about what this provokes in you, or where you think it's pointing you? Because there's a lot that's in here. I see Horty.
It's brought up for me the idea that no matter what viewpoint I land on, I better be questioning it.
Yeah.
No matter what opinion I have about anything ever. Why am I feeling that? Where did it come from? What's the ground of that? What's the viewpoint that I've decided has to be right? What are the other sides of the argument? It just brings up that whole question of how we get to our belief structure and how structured we allow it to keep us.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Peter. Look at that. He did the whole thumbs up. I love that too. And then there's the other thing that it's like we can go to that place where we can almost become the whole analysis paralysis thing. But I do think that so that you can overly look at everything and sort of question your motivations, and then all of a sudden it can stop you. But I don't think that's what you're saying, and I don't think that's what the parable is asking. It's more about that being humble, being sort of operating from that place of humility and respect that is so crucial. That it's not about being ardent, it's not about being certain in everything we do, but doing our best to kind of act out of that spirit of love and humble grace. Any other comments, Marilyn?
Right now, I'm doing a whole lot of thinking about the basis for the decisions that I make, whether it's from here or from here. And it seems to me that if you're going to, so if you've got 77 or you've got 7 or whatever times, you can almost picture somebody keeping a tally. Okay, and that's very much from here. From the heart, it's more really thinking about the other person, and I don't know exactly even how to put it into words, but there's empathy involved, and I guess empathy is what I'm thinking of as the strongest.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I
see that contrast being made, especially with the last verse.
Right. It's a deep contrast. One is a way of being in the world. It's a way of approaching others. The other is, as you said, very list oriented. It's like keeping a tally, as if that's the highest way of being. And, that sort of gets us to that place of rules following self-righteousness that is constantly being sort of lifted up as, no, that's not what our deepest way of practicing following God looks like. It's just not. It's not about that. So again, this parable so succinctly and I think beautifully, elegantly lifts that contrast up for us, for sure. Dan.
Okay.
Paraphrasing what Marilyn just said, heck off, I only have 76 more. But if it's you forgiven, that's from the heart.
You were blipping out, but I think I got the gist that it's not about the numbers, it's not about the math, but it's about forgiving from this place here. And when we do that, it frees us from sort of the need to tally. Is that?
Yes, it was, but it was also I versus you.
Very good.
I forgive you, and you are forgiven.
Yes.
A big difference.
Yes. Yeah, it moves the locus of our consideration from here, from ourselves to the other, as Marilyn said. Beautiful. Yep. Anyone else? Bertie.
Now, between the time when the slave put the other slave in jail and the king summoned him and corrected him, we don't know how much time there was, but there was some time in which that slave could have repented and gone back and told this one he put in jail, I was wrong, I do forgive you, and gotten him out of jail. There was a time frame where he could have made it right.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of telling us that if we're going to stay hard-hearted and not be forgiving, then there's likely going to come a time when we can no longer make things right.
Yeah.
For us, most likely that would be like through death or the death of the person we're not forgiving, but there will come a time when you can't, you can no longer do the forgiving.
Yeah, I think you've named something really, another powerful angle here. You know, that's the unforgiving slave very clearly operated out of his fear. We didn't talk about this, but 100 denarii, we often think, oh, that's just a pittance, right? It's not an insignificant amount. It's a significant amount. 1 denarius was 1 day's pay. So 100 denarii was 3.5 months worth of pay. That's a lot. But he was operating out of that space of scarcity, of needing to get his, that for whatever reason, and the parable doesn't go into the detail, but it tells us that he didn't forgive and that he never, for whatever time he might have had, he never kind of went back on his initial decision either. So he is operating from that space. And maybe that's what it's trying to tell us, is that he was stuck there. That, you know how it is, when we operate from certain ways, whether it's fear, whether it's anger, whether it's resentment, whether it's grief, if we operate in those spaces long enough, they do galvanize, they do harden in us, like you were saying, and it becomes increasingly difficult, if not, I don't know, I don't want to call it impossible, but it just becomes increasingly difficult to maneuver outside of that. It's like when we don't stretch, our muscles atrophy, they you know, and it just becomes harder and harder to go and do yoga or something, you know, that puts you in that more supple way. It hurts. So I like what you bring up there. I think it's a real truth. And again, not necessarily a punishment that God imposes or that the king in this parable imposes, but that's a part of the consequence of living this way long term, when we operate from out of this scarcity mindset, this numbers and accounting mindset. Other questions or comments or thoughts or disagreements even, because it's always welcome. Because that's the fun of this. That's the power of it. You know, this is a story that in some ways is certainly hyperbolic. It might even be intended to be funny because it's so ridiculous, but it certainly makes a very, very important, serious point. So it's playing on a lot of different responses and emotions here. I see Marilyn.
Yeah, my initial reaction to the fellow slaves or servants or whatever who turned him in was kind of a "we the people" sort of response. Oh, good. Here are people who are standing up for what happened to this poor other slave or servant,
Mhm.
and so reported on what had happened, what had been done, and so I think there are some ways in which even the "we the people" kind of part of our society is it can have some problems,
Yeah.
and I don't know quite how to take that any farther, but we would be applauding people who turned somebody in, say a white supremacist or whatever, who had done a lot of damage to the Black community, and people who turned this person in. This is the person who's done that. We would applaud.
I think you're right. And I think that's the natural for many of us to operate from that place. And I think that this parable is challenging us not to, and to sort of say, even if we say, oh, good on you, we have, if you start pointing a finger, that's a good indicator that, okay, I need to check that. That's one of those areas where we need to look at, okay, what's my motivation here? Am I falling into the same trap, perhaps, that say, in this case, the unforgiving slave did? And again, it's putting it out there for us to consider. Wherein lies our motivation for these things we do? I saw Steve.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that as you mentioned, that the numbers here are kind of over the top. The proposition that a slave or a servant would owe his king 10,000 talents is, over the top. But
Right.
equally, it's kind of ludicrous that another slave or servant would owe 100 denarii to another slave or servant. It doesn't fit. So I think they're conflated to make a point
Yes.
that forgiveness isn't a measure.
Yes.
It's simply what you hand someone when they've wronged you or they owe you or for whatever.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a measure to it. It's forgiveness.
Exactly. I think you're exactly right. And if it has to be measured, if we find ourselves wanting to quantify it, if we ask the Peter question, then perhaps we don't really understand what forgiveness is. And maybe we've never been able to practice it, because that's still an accounting. And so we got to move away from the calculus, from the accounting way of being. Again, that's a huge challenge. And I know there's lots of examples we can think of. But again, these parables aren't trying to come up with the comprehensive here. They're trying to illustrate a principle, a way of being, a way of approaching life, of approaching conflict, of approaching, being in community. Okay. All right. Does anyone else have some closing comments or thoughts?
Just thank you.
Thank you all for another rich conversation. Looking forward to continuing this for the next month or so, and then we'll see what happens after that, because who knows, we might be getting back together live when we come back together, but we'll see. We'll keep on top of that. So be sure to look on the church website to get the notes, because you'll see what the added sessions are and what the readings are, and we'll make sure you have that. But for now, thank you for being here this week again, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Yes.